What if the person you thought was dead for nearly a decade suddenly stood at your doorstep? What if the crime you buried deep in the past came back to haunt you in the most terrifying way possible? Tonight, on True Crime Atlas, we unravel a story so chilling, so unbelievable, that it sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller. A man who thought he had committed the perfect Crimea-staged accident, a missing wife, and an airtight alibi was forced to face the one thing he never expected: her return. Stay with us, because this journey into the darkness of one twisted husband's mind will leave you questioning just how secure the justice system truly is when the criminal is a brilliant attorney adept at dancing around the law. We will reveal how one woman survived the impossible, how her husband nearly escaped the consequences of plotting her murder, and how the past he believed was gone resurfaced at his moment of greatest triumph. If stories like this captivate you, remember to subscribe to True Crime Atlas. Real-life mysteries and shocking revelations await those who dare to peer into the unknown. Now, let us begin. Marcus Harrington had a golden reputation in legal circles. A charismatic criminal defense attorney, he excelled at defending clients who seemed indefensible. He thrived on stacking the deck in his favor: corporate crooks facing fraud charges, violent offenders backed into a corner by piles of incriminating evidence, even mob families entrenched in decades of organized crime. No one else wanted these cases because the guilt felt obvious, the stakes astronomical. But adversity never deterred Marcus. He had a peculiar brilliance for weaving narratives in court that danced around the law and toyed with the truth, leading judges and juries to see his clients as misunderstood or unjustly targeted. In short, Marcus possessed an ability to interpret the law in ways that benefited the guilty, and people both feared and admired him for it. To the public, he was magnetic, a tall, confident figure who radiated knowledge and sophistication. The press described him as a dazzling legal mind, always accompanied by a supportive, graceful wife at his side. Sophia Harrington was a respected journalist before her marriage to Marcus, specializing in long-form investigative pieces that took her around the globe. She reported on political corruption, social justice issues in war-torn regions, and stories of desperate survivors overcoming impossible odds. When she met Marcus, his sharp ambition and intellectual prowess pulled her in. She believed him to be a champion of people who lacked a proper defense, a hero forging justice by ensuring everyone's right to representation. But her admiration gradually eroded under the weight of revelation. The first fracture appeared when she recognized Marcus's approach to law was less about championing the helpless and more about demonstrating his superiority. She noticed how detached he seemed from his clients, seldom registering moral outrage, even if the details of their crimes were heinous. To Marcus, guilt or innocence mattered less than whether he could craft a winning argument. They were married young. In those heady days of early romance, she swore she could sense genuine tenderness in him. He courted her with lavish, gesture-exclusive dinners, trips to Europe, designer gifts. At work events, he would stand close, hand gently placed on her back, proclaiming to friends and acquaintances that he owed so much of his success to his brilliant wife. But once they settled into routine life and past that honeymoon haze, cracks began to show. Marcus dominated their conversations, dismissed her concerns, belittled her decisions, and expertly twisted every disagreement so that she always found herself doubting what she knew to be true. It was the beginning of a subtle yet relentless campaign of psychological warfare. At first, Sophia thought perhaps it was just stress. Marcus's cases had grown higher profile, piling pressure on him, so maybe he needed a safe outlet. But as her own career soared, her reports published in major outlets, lauded for their insight, Marcus seemed more possessive than proud. He started dictating how she spent her time, interfering with her stories, warning her that the real world isn't fair, and that she needed to be careful who you cross. Soon, Sophia discovered he was not just controlling her professional life, He was policing finances, funneling money into joint accounts she could not easily track, diminishing her sense of independence. That was when she learned of his affairs. Several, strung along over various business trips and late nights at the office. She felt naive for suspecting only one mistress. In reality, it appeared he had been unfaithful since well before they even discussed marriage. Betrayed and enraged, she confronted him, expecting either contrition or remorse. Instead, he shrugged it off, with a cold aloofness that was more chilling than any raving confession of guilt. He reminded her that their image as a power couple was beneficial to both her career and his. He accused her of throwing away their social standing if she chose to divorce. He hammered home the idea that if she so much as threatened to leave, he would ensure she ended up with nothing. Sophia realized that the Marcus she had fallen for was a crafted illusion. Behind the promises and the outward warmth lurked a man who saw relationships as transactional, people as game pieces, and love as a convenient front that could be leveraged for personal gain. She was ready to leave, to vanish from his orbit. But a serendipitous discovery changed everything. A life insurance policy taken out on her for $3 million. She recalled the date with a chill. It had been filed months before she ever mentioned divorce. She knew exactly what it meant. Marcus was calculating scenarios in which her life ended, and he collected a massive sum as a grieving husband. He was covering every angle. Her instincts told her to run. Any illusions she had about his moral boundaries evaporated. Marcus was ruthless both in the courtroom and at home. But she also knew from her investigative experience that abrupt movements invite scrutiny. If he suspected she had caught wind of his plan, he might accelerate his timeline. So she stayed quiet, hoping to gather enough evidence or a semblance of a plan to extract herself safely. Yet Marcus proved one step ahead once again. He invited her on a final trip. A romantic sailing journey off the coast of Maine. "No more fights," he insisted. "Just you and me. A peaceful goodbye to our marriage. Then we can part ways." She felt her body stiffen with dread the moment he said it. The subtext all too clear. The vessel Marcus chartered was a sleek, immaculate sailboat, with polished decks and crisp white sails that gleamed under the summer sun. As they drove from Boston, hauling their luggage and provisions, Sophia watched every mile marker pass as though she was drifting closer to her grave. She tried to maintain composure, but anxiety clung to her heart, quickening her pulse. Marcus tracked her with sidelong glances, studying her reaction. She kept a forced, polite stiffness to her smile, as though she were holding onto a lifeline of silent caution. When they arrived at the marina, the water looked deceptively tranquil. A few distant gulls cried overhead, boats bobbed on gentle waves, and a sea breeze carried a briny tang that might have been pleasant under different circumstances. The first few hours out at sea were oddly serene, a long lull of conversation and the occasional encouragement from Marcus to relax and enjoy. He uncorked fine wine, prepared a charcuterie, pointed to the horizon as if the expanse of ocean was the perfect symbol for a fresh start. But Sophia could not stop seeing the invisible clock ticking under each wave, counting down to whatever horrifying plan he had constructed. Sunset painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, while they drifted along an isolated stretch of open water. Marcus made a show of adjusting sails, checking the weather forecast, securing a small anchor if they decided to remain adrift through the night. But there was no question who truly captained this voyage. He exuded a casual authority that left her guarded. She ate little, fearing any beverage he handed her could be drugged. But after a day of tension and a swirl of sea air, she felt the edges of her mind fraying with exhaustion. Night fell, the ocean turning dark and choppy, faint moonlight revealing only a vague silhouette of the boat's edges. That was when Marcus poured another round of wine. "A final toast," he said softly, flashing that old disarming smile. "To closure." She watched him raise the glass to his lips, apparently taking a sip, That moment tested her instincts. She thought, if he drinks from his own glass, perhaps he wants me to believe it's safe. But she felt cornered. If she refused outright, he might confirm she was onto him. She raised the wine to her mouth, touching it hesitantly to her lips. She tasted the bitterness, only faintly masked by the grape. Almost immediately, a swirl of dizziness crawled behind her eyes, and a wave of heat flooded her face. The deck seemed to tilt beneath her feet, or maybe it was just the effect of the drugs. She tried to will herself awake, to remain vigilant, but her limbs turned heavy, as though weighed down by lead. Marcus leaned in to catch her as she swayed. "It's going to be over soon," he whispered, his breath brushing her ear. That was the last coherent thing she remembered before the darkness. She awoke to panic in her lungs and the thunder of seawater surging into her mouth. Gasping and coughing, Sophia found herself in the ocean, nearly paralyzed by cold. The fierce shock of salt stung her eyes. Waves jostled her like a rag doll. Over the roar, she heard the engine of the sailboat, shifting from a lull to a steady hum as it drifted away. Her arms flailed in the blackness, desperate to stay afloat. She glimpsed Marcus on the deck, his outline dimly visible against the distant boat lights. He did not offer a rope, did not even call out. He simply stood there in silent observation, as if confirming she was no longer in his way. She choked on salt water, clinging to the flicker of consciousness while her body threatened to capitulate. Each wave hammered her downward. The burn in her muscles was unbearable, but adrenaline and the primal will to live consumed her. She spotted debris, a large piece of wood jarred loose from something on deck. Fighting numbness, she kicked through the swells to reach it, grasping the rough edges with trembling hands. Then everything became a blur of desperate survival. She bobbed in and out of consciousness, uncertain how many hours or days might have passed. The sun rose at some point, searing her already battered skin. Unquenchable thirst tore at her throat. She hallucinated shapes in the horizon, each wave blurring into the next. The survival instincts hammered at her. Keep your grip. Do not let go. Float. Salt crusted her hair and eyelashes. But she clung to that plank, as though it were her only tether to the living world. When she finally felt something solid under her, it was a remote shoreline, a tiny patch of island far from any bustling port. Disoriented, half-blind, and scarcely alive, she collapsed onto wet sand. And then she sensed a presence, a figure stooping near her, coarse hands lifting her battered body. Sophia remembered hearing a gentle, accented voice speaking in low tones, "You poor child, I've got you." And then she drifted back into darkness. Margaret was an enigma wrapped in a plain flannel shirt, her wiry hair in a perpetual tangle. She lived in a modest wooden cabin tucked between wild trees on an island that barely appeared on most maps. In her youth, Margaret had served as a trauma nurse in bustling city hospitals, treating patients battered by violence or accidents. But somewhere along the way, she grew disillusioned, weary of the chaos, and disappeared from mainstream life. Nobody came looking for her, and she never blamed them. This island, isolated and harsh, offered her the solitude she needed. Sophia was nearly comatose when Margaret dragged her into the cabin and laid her out on a makeshift bed. The nurse's training took over out of pure muscle memory. She checked for signs of concussion, hauled out every bit of medical supply she handled: antibiotic creams, sterilized bandages, morphine vials she'd stored for emergencies. For weeks, Sophia lay in a state of delirium, tossing and turning through fever and infection. Margaret coaxed water and broth into her parched mouth. She cleaned salt from Sophia's wounds and placed cold compresses on her forehead. Outside, the waves beat relentlessly against the shore, a reminder of how precarious Sophia's rescue had been. Sophia's mind wandered in fragments of nightmares. She saw glimpses of Marcus's face peering down at her, sometimes morphing into that stark, emotionless gaze on the boat. She jerked awake to see the interior of Margaret's cabin, only to slip under again. Somewhere in the haze, she felt warm compresses on her forehead, heard the rhythmic murmur of Margaret's gentle humming, and recognized that this woman was saving her life. When she finally stabilized and could sit up beneath the cabin's single flickering lantern, Margaret brought her a cup of herbal tea. Cautiously, the old nurse examined her eyes and asked with unexpected softness, "What's your name, dear?" It took Sophia several tries before her swollen throat could manage the sound. "Sophia?" she rasped, tears leaking from the sheer relief of forming words. Margaret did not rush to interrogate her. She simply assured Sophia she was safe here. She showed her how to open the cabin door to let in fresh air, pointed out the well out back for clean water, and promised that her bota, small motorized dinghy, could occasionally ferry them to another distant island for supplies. In these early days, Sophia shared little about her past. Somehow, Margaret sensed the trauma was too raw. She would feed Sophia, watch her with knowing eyes, and whisper that she had seen many battered souls. They simply needed time. Safety was healing enough at first. Eventually, the nightmares ebbed, and Sophia was strong enough to walk along the beach. Every step was a lesson in resilience. She recalled the ocean swallowing her, the salt water burning her lungs, the betrayal that had her fighting to raise her head above each wave. Yet, as she moved across the sand, letting the wind ruffle her hair, she realized that she had survived. By all logic, she should have drowned. But her body and will refused to quit. Months blurred together on the island, each day starting with chores that kept them alive, gathering driftwood for the stove, filtering water, and tending to a small vegetable plot. Margaret had a collection of old newspapers and a battery-powered radio that caught random signals on certain nights. Through these meager resources, Sophia tried to piece together the outside world, especially regarding any news from Boston or beyond. During this time, her partial amnesia lifted cautiously. She remembered more details of Marcus's face as he watched her struggle in the water. She recalled the forging of the life insurance documents, the quiet way he manipulated her finances, the creeping suspicion that preceded this final trip. No single revelation shattered her illusions. It was a slow, painful coalescence of memory. Every time a piece of knowledge slid into place, a fresh wave of rage and despair coursed through her. She was a journalist by trade. Uncovering truth was her life's work. But no story had ever struck her so personally or laid her own life bare in such horrifying detail. Margaret refrained from urging Sophia to go to the police. She recognized it was Sophia's decision, and Sophia herself sensed she had to tread carefully. Marcus would have covered his tracks well. She was sure he had given a perfect performance to the world her lost-at-sea tragedy. Perhaps tears for the cameras, a swift conclusion by investigators that she simply drowned during an unfortunate sailing accident. Without a body, and with his legal acumen, the case would likely not have gone far, especially if he bribed or manipulated the insurance claims and made sure the local authorities viewed it as a straightforward disappearance. In that powerless gloom, Sophia found an unlikely source of hope in Margaret's quiet counsel. "Child," she would say, "if the law can't help you right now, you help yourself. There's power in patience. Let him grow comfortable. Let him think he's won." So that became Sophia's plan. Wait, gather information, and strike when the time was right. By the time Sophia regained her full health, the world had moved on. Years passed with the tide. The quiet island existence provided her with a rare vantage point. Removed from society, she could watch events unfold from afar. She improvised ways of accessing the internet if she traveled with Margaret to a neighboring island that had sporadic Wi-Fi in their tiny fishing village. She scoured news archives, trying to find any mention of Marcus or her own disappearance. She discovered that indeed, coverage of her vanishing was minimal. Local Boston news ran a short series about a journalist presumed lost at sea. No suspicious circumstances were reported. Then there was a terse statement from Marcus Harrington, who expressed heartbreak and extended blessings that her body might be recovered someday for closure. His performance was heartbreakingly convincing. She dug deeper. It seemed within a year he had relocated to Chicago. His name surfaced in legal journals. Apparently, he expanded his practice, taking on even more sensational cases. She found references to him on television talk shows, analyzing high-profile murder trials. He had even authored books on criminal psychology and the intricacies of skillful defense tactics. The man who tried to murder her was thriving, building an empire on the ashes of her memory. Each new piece of evidence was a tightening coil in Sophia's gut. But she focused on her objective: survive now, exact justice later. She spent hours scribbling down date insurance policy details, financial transactions, a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. She wrote everything in battered notebooks Margaret had stashed away. It became an obsession. She documented the color of the wine they drank, the type of sails on the boat, the name of the marina they departed from, every nuance of that final night. She compiled a small library of her own recollections, cross-referenced with public records, determined that one day, if and when she came forward, the evidence would be indisputable. After 8 years, news of Marcus reached an apex. His face appeared on major television networks, praising him as a top analyst for complicated criminal cases. He had a syndicated radio segment and was pegged by some as a visionary in legal strategy. He was about to release a new book, The Psychology of Criminal Defense, scheduled for a high-profile launch in downtown Chicago. That was the moment Sophia knew if she was to take him down, there would be no stage more fitting than the one he was currently occupying with such swagger. But how to emerge from the dead? She had no official identity now. Her passport and driver's license had long since expired or been declared void the moment authorities declared her legally deceased. There was an undeniable risk that if she simply showed up at his book signing, Marcus might try to have her eliminated before she spoke another word. She needed intelligence. She needed to slip back into the world in a new form before unveiling herself as Sophia Harrington. She confided in Margaret, who offered to connect her with a contact in a nearby port town, someone who specialized in forging discreet documentation for those in need. The moral compromise weighed on Sophia, but she saw no alternative. She had been pronounced dead. The legal system was not going to revive her identity without an uphill battle. This pragmatic approach allowed her to re-enter the mainland under an alias. Though the process was nerve-wracking, she traveled by ferry initially, then by bus, always paying with cash and leaving no digital footprints. Upon reaching a sizable city, Sophia contacted an old friend from her journalism days, Elisa Walters, a fellow reporter who had worked with her on a scandal piece for the Boston Gazette. Elisa picked up the unrecognized number with that trademark caution journalists develop. When she heard Sophia's trembling voice on the line, she fell silent at first, disbelieving. They arranged to meet in a quiet coffee shop where they sat in a corner booth. Elisa touched Sophia's arm, tears brimming. "I grieved for you," she whispered. "We all did. What happened?" With measured calm, Sophia recounted her entire ordeal. She stressed that no one else could know she was alive, at least not yet. Elisa agreed, but insisted they had to gather bulletproof evidence that Marcus had orchestrated the murder. Otherwise, he would spin the story to claim she had staged her disappearance for attention. Sophia shared her notebooks, her meticulously documented timeline. Elisa's face grew paler with each new page, a myriad of emotions flickering from horror to fury. She agreed to help. Over the following months, they coordinated with a handful of trusted legal experts, people not under Marcus's sway. They examined the fine print of the life insurance policy, the suspicious date of purchase, the sudden shift of funds into an offshore account weeks after Sophia's disappearance. It was a tapestry of cold calculation. but one that required a final, undeniable stitch. A confession or an admission from Marcus himself. Sophia proposed the plan. She would attend his book-signing event. An auditorium would be filled with fans, aspiring lawyers, possibly journalists. Cameras would roll. If she revealed herself in that intense public environment, he might slip into shock and blurt something incriminating. Elisa offered to bring a high-end recording device concealed under normal clothes, and they arranged for more than one vantage point. Elisa and a backup collaborator would each have microphones, ensuring that if one failed, the other captured the moment. It was risky, but it had the element of spectacle that could break through Marcus's carefully crafted image. The day arrived, overshadowed by anxiety. Sophia dressed plainly, pulling her hair back, her face partially shielded by a wide-brimmed hat. She felt her heart pounding as she stepped inside the bustling conference center. The air smelled of new books and coffee, with attendees chatting excitedly about meeting the brilliant Marcus Harrington. Sophia drifted among them, unnoticed. Perhaps some found her vaguely familiar, but no one truly recognized the face of a woman believed dead for nearly a decade. When Marcus finally appeared on stage, he wore the polished aura of a television personality. His tailored suit fit perfectly. He flashed that charismatic grin for the cameras, thanking everyone for coming. Then he spoke about the complexities of criminal defense, weaving in anecdotes from his notable cases. The crowd hung on his every word. Sophia's stomach churned. This was the same man who had once been her husband, who coldly watched her sink into treacherous waters. She waited until he opened a Q&A session. One by one, audience members took the microphone, asking about trial strategies and moral dilemmas. Marcus answered each question deftly, never losing composure. Finally, Sophia stood. Her voice trembled only slightly. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "could you share your thoughts on defending a high-profile killer who has personal ties to the victim?" Marcus began to answer automatically. But then, in mid-sentence, his eyes narrowed on her face. He froze, mouth parted, color slipping away. Shock replaced his confident veneer. He took a few steps back from the podium, each second of silence ramping up the tension in the auditorium. Attendees glanced about, murmuring in alarm. Sophia removed her hat. Her eyes locked on his. Barely above a whisper, she asked, "What's wrong, Marcus? You look like you've seen a ghost." He tried to step away from the microphone, but she moved closer. His face was ashen, haunted. In that moment, the entire audience leaned forward, sensing something momentous unfolding. Somewhere off to the side, Elisa discreetly adjusted a hidden device, making sure every syllable was recorded. Cameras from local media just happened to be filming, capturing every subtle shift of Marcus's expression. Then came Marcus's whisper, trembling and laced with dread, "I watched you sink." The statement echoed in the eerily hushed space. A wave of confusion swept the crowd. They couldn't yet grasp the meaning of those 4 words. But for Sophia, those who had conspired to broadcast this moment, it was the final puzzle piece they needed. Media outlets devoured the story within hours. That short, incriminating phrase from Marcus Harrington was replayed endlessly on nightly news. "I watched you sink." Legal analysts dissected every nuance. Psychologists weighed in, speculating how a man so composed could unravel so thoroughly in a single sentence. The Chicago police announced they were reopening the investigation into the disappearance and presumed death of Sophia Harrington. Marcus attempted damage control. He held a press conference the following day, stammering an explanation that the words had been misinterpreted, that he had been grieving and confused. But the confession played over and over. Pundits noted the terror on his face was impossible to hide. Sophia, meanwhile, came forward with an on-camera statement, her identity confirmed via old dental records and cross-referenced family documents. She recounted her version of events, concluding with a measured, furious line, He took me out to sea to murder me for profit, and he left me there. Suddenly, every detail of Marcus's life was under scrutiny. Investigators found evidence of the illicit insurance policy that had paid out not long after Sophia's disappearance. They unearthed emails, offshore bank accounts, and suspicious financial transfers. Forensic accountants pinned down a timeline that matched precisely her final trip with Marcus. An ex-associate from his law firm claimed Marcus had confided in him about wanting Sophia out of the picture, but the man admitted he never believed Marcus would go so far as to kill her. This time the net was cast wide, and every lead pointed straight to Marcus's guilt. Arrest soon followed. In images that circulated online, the once smug and composed defense attorney was led away in handcuffs from his downtown skyscraper office. His eyes were hollow, fury etched into his face. He tried to rally his old legal connections, but most swiftly distanced themselves, unwilling to tether their reputations to a man potentially capable of murder. Even those who remained loyal found it nearly impossible to spin the facts to Marcus's advantage. There was audio evidence, bank records, and the living, breathing victim herself, who was more than prepared to testify in court. The courtroom brimmed with reporters, true crime buffs, law students, and curiosity seekers. Marcus strode in wearing a standard suit, but he appeared diminished, subdued. The prosecuting attorney laid out a methodical presentation, painting a picture of a brilliant but morally barren man who saw even his own spouse as a pawn. They showed the timeline of events, from the forging of particular insurance documents many months prior, to the alleged drugging of Sophia, culminating in the revelation of his own damning words. Despite the hopeless odds, Marcus tried to lean on his rhetorical prowess. He made glancing references to spousal strife, tried to insinuate that Sophia had plotted her own disappearance, and wove a series of half-baked theories about how her story was an attention-grabbing hoax. But each time he attempted to cast doubt, the prosecution countered with forensic data. They showcased digital footprints, a purchase of potent sedatives a week before the sailing trip, contradictory statements he made to insurance investigators, carefully timed financial moves that aligned with the day of Sophia's presumed death. Sophia took the stand. The tension in the courtroom was tangible as she recounted every detail. Her romance with Marcus, the creeping realization of his affairs, the discovery of the insurance policy, and his final betrayal in the middle of the ocean. She spoke without tears, her voice steady, as though the years of isolation and healing had steeled her. She recounted the moment she regained consciousness amid the waves, choking on salt water, only to see him stand there impassive before motoring away. The jury hung on to her every word. Marcus tried to cross-examine her personally, but his questions quickly faltered. She answered precisely, displaying calm assurance that disallowed any narrative manipulations. It was a chilling reversal of roles. The man accustomed to dominating cross-examinations found himself cornered by the truth. When the trial reached its closing arguments, the prosecution hammered home the same phrase repeated by the press. "I watched you sink." They underscored that no normal grieving spouse would use such wording, nor would they wait years before claiming insurance money and shifting it overseas. The defense had no coherent response. The jury took only a few hours to deliberate. Marcus Harrington was found guilty of attempted murder for financial gain, along with insurance fraud and a litany of other charges. His sentencing hearing took place in a packed courtroom. The judge declared him a manipulative predator who undermined the sanctity of marriage and the trust in the legal profession. Without chance of parole, Marcus's life was effectively sealed behind prison walls. When the verdict was pronounced, a hush fell over the room. Reporters whispered hurried takes to their live feeds, cameras snapped, and spectators gasped. Marcus seemed nearly catatonic. The crash from his pinnacle of celebrity to this thorough condemnation was more than his psyche could bear. As deputies escorted him away, he risked a final glance at Sophia seated in the gallery. She held his gaze without flinching. For the first time, the hallmark cunning in his eyes was replaced by palpable fear. Sophia felt an immense wave of relief. Justice, after so many years of living as a ghost, was finally served. But it wasn't merely a legal victory. It was personal vindication. She had proven him wrong. She had survived when every violent plan he set in motion predicted her demise. She had not only undone his scheme, but dismantled his reputation. In a single moment of confrontation, everything he had built on her supposed death crumbled. The media had a field day with her story. Offers for interviews, documentaries, even film adaptations poured in. She turned most of them down. To a degree, she participated in a handful of interviews to clarify the facts and expose the dangers of manipulative relationships. But she did not wish to become a spectacle. She had endured enough years being invisible. She did not care to spend the next years exploited as a media figure. Inside, she felt the hollowness of trauma. She still woke up from nightmares about drowning in black water. She still remembered the terror of Marcus's last words. The sting of betrayal from someone she had once loved. Immediately after the trial, she worked with authorities to reinstate her legal identity. It was a labyrinth of paperwork, especially because she had been declared legally dead. She faced countless appointments, reissuing of documents, physical verifications through close relatives. Some extended family wept at her reappearance. Others met her with uneasy shock. But she pressed through the disorienting swirl of reacclimation to society. Nothing felt normal, but it was a step toward forging a renewed life. Trauma seldom fades cleanly. Some nights, Sophia still jerked awake, drenched in sweat, her mind replaying the moment she saw Marcus standing on the deck. She would almost hear the boat's engine hum, feel the frigid drag of salt water on her limbs. In those moments her heart raced uncontrollably. But then she would sit up, flip on a small lamp, realize she was safe in her own cottage. She would breathe slowly, focusing on the present. She had endured. No dream could rob her of the reality that she won. She sometimes corresponded with Margaret, the woman who saved her life. They exchanged letters, because Margaret disliked modern technology. Margaret described the quiet events on the island, new storms that uprooted old trees, the sporadic visitors who rarely stayed. In return, Sophia shared updates on her new life, the court proceedings, the final downfall of Marcus Harrington, carefully omitting specific details that might threaten the old nurse's cherished solitude. Their bond was unique, forged through a salvation unspoken. As the months passed, Sophia felt bits of normalcy creeping back. She made acquaintances in her coastal community, a baker across the street who offered her fresh bread, a retired fisherman who taught her how to cast a line off the pier. Sometimes they invited her to casual gatherings, fish fries along the shore. She attended, forging new memories that softened the edges of her past. She laughed at jokes, felt sunlight on her face, and realized how starved she had been for genuine human connection. Sometimes the lines between truth and fiction are so knotted that stories of survival feel almost impossible to believe. Sophia Harrington's case shattered the notion that perfect crimes exist. Her husband, a master of the legal system, believed he had devised an unstoppable plan that would rid him of an inconvenient wife and enrich him in the process. He never accounted for her unyielding will to live, nor did he foresee the remote island inhabitant who would nurse her back to health, nor the unwavering journalistic mind that would doggedly gather the evidence needed to incriminate him. Our society sometimes idolizes smart lawyers who outwit the system. But Marcus Harrington is proof that, no matter how clever one is in the courtroom, the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Sophia's reappearance at that book event was the last scenario Marcus imagined. He was undone in the glare of the cameras, the moment recorded for the entire world to watch. And in that moment his carefully crafted image collapsed. It is fitting, then, that we share this cautionary tale here on True Crime Atlas, where reality consistently proves stranger than any fictitious plot. The lessons resonate far beyond the sensational headlines. Do not underestimate individuals who seem infallible, and never assume the ocean can keep a secret. Victims, however powerless they appear, can hold unimaginable strength. Lies, no matter how eloquently spun, can be unspooled by one honest confession uttered in shock. Sophia now wanders the shoreline by her cottage, sometimes with a camera in hand, capturing sunsets that paint the sky in gold and purple. She appreciates the simplicity, the raw beauty of each passing day. In these moments she does not dwell on betrayal or revenge. She focuses on the gift of breath, on the saltiness in the air that once almost suffocated her. She is no longer the vanished wife. She is a survivor, and she will never again be silent. If you found this chilling tale as riveting as we did, remember to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Atlas for more stories that test the limits of belief. Fear not the dark corners of humanity, for when shed upon by truth, even the deepest shadows reveal themselves. And if this story can teach us anything, it is that sometimes the dead do indeed come back.